But it all started with this one image of this carousel, which I painted when I was in the 10th, must have been the second half of the 10th grade in high school, which was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We had a wonderful art teacher in high school, and he encouraged this whole group of kids. I mean, this was a lower class high school, mostly lower class, maybe a few upper middle class people. It was a mix of neighborhoods, and it was a mix of black and white, too, which was nobody thought too much of at that time. There were about 15 of us who would gather late in the afternoon every day after classes and just do our own projects. Joseph Fitzpatrick was the teacher's name. Well, I did this as a painting. It was actually my first painting in oils. Before that, I painted in poster paints. And it's of a carousel that actually existed in a park in Pittsburgh near the high school. And this is a nighttime view of it. It was small, and I'd pass it at night. Anyway, the painting was done actually from memory, not from photographs, or not on the spot, all memory. The incredible thing is, the year later, when I was in the 11th grade, it won first prize in oil painting in National Scholastic High School contest. But even more incredible was that the exhibition it was part of, the National Scholastic exhibition, was taken up by it opened at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, but moved to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where the show was written up by Life magazine. Life magazine at the time was a big cultural force. And all the prize winners were reproduced. There were about 16. But my painting was given a full half page to itself. And below that was another painting. I'll come back to that. At any rate, I had my senior year in high school then, and I won first prize again. And that gave me a scholarship. At this time, World War II started. There was this national conscription. Everybody was called up for draft if you were at the age of 18. But because I had won a scholarship to Carnegie Institute of Technology Art School, I was given a deferment for that school year. And then I was drafted and spent the next 3 years in the Army, two of which were in Italy, the final two. At any rate, this is the painting that was reproduced in Life magazine. And as I said, at the end of basic infantry training, I was put into a special unit for 6 or 7 months with a group of men who had been in civilian life in commercial art, mostly in advertising. And what we did were a series of charts on infantry weapons and how to read maps, how to use a compass for training purposes, for use out in the field training on the spot. We did everything. And I learned everything. I learned a great deal from these men. Page design, layout, lettering, typefaces, perspective, how to use drafting implements. And then we silk screened. This is one chart I did everything on myself. The placement, the design. It's 4 feet high. Now to me today, it looks amazingly like prefigures pop art. At any rate, this was when I was in my 19th year. I was allowed to bring this one home because, as you can see, it's marked NG, which meant no good. I don't know why. There's a little smear up on top above the N and the S. Well, then I went back into the infantry and was in the infantry in Italy during the fighting. When the fighting ended, I was transferred to an engineering company where I did road signs for a company that was rebuilding the 2-lane highway between Rome and the city of Florence. That was my third year in the Army. When I came out, I went back to Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh, and there I showed all the stuff I had done in the Army to the design professor, and he hired me to work as one of his 3 assistants on a group of folders for the Aluminum Company of America on architectural products for the building trades. And I worked for him for the next 3 years around the school schedule, mostly weekends and holidays in the summers. Again, it was very invaluable. I learned all about color separations, preparing the work for the printer. I actually did that little painting of the frame for the sewer lid, which was aluminum. Those are cross sections of the aluminum frame. The hydrant was my invention. I also did those large letters, the capitals, vault sections, and the word aluminum. Well, on the basis of this kind of work, I became the art director for the Carnegie Technical, which was the engineering school publication. I did design covers and inside illustrations. This was a cover that demonstrates an article that was about an article about how people who design the machines that the workers' hands are stuck into have to be protected. The top part looks like straight German expressionism, but I think it's good design. And for my portfolio to present to what I could do, to the, what do you call them? Art directors of advertising and magazines and so forth. When I came to New York, I prepared a series of charts and a pamphlet to show what I could do. I thought it's based on the idea of training aids, and I thought there was a place for that sort of thing in public education, visualization of rather complex ideas. For some reason, I picked a chapter of the United States Constitution to work with, which turned out to be a disaster, but that's another story. This was the cover for the initial pamphlet that would describe what the charts were about. On the basis of that, I got a job with a top-notch graphic designer in New York City. He was from Czechoslovakia. He'd been a very big, important designer during the 2 wars, World War I and II, and had come to America the late 1930s as part of the design project for the Czech Pavilion at 1939 World's Fair. And the Germans had sent him here to sell off the materials before the building went up. He had designed the building. He was the architect of it. At any rate, that somehow got him a job as director of an organization that called Sweets Catalogs, which published 21 volumes a year for all the catalogs of products made for the building trades. He was the overall design coordinator, and I worked on a few projects for himself, mostly on a series of catalogs on American standard sanitary equipment. However, this page was a special project he did within months of my arrival in his office. As the youngest person, I was the most expendable, I guess. And his friend Buckminster Fuller was going to design a small, not a catalog, a booklet that would be sent as a Christmas greeting, a seasoned greeting to Sweets Catalog's customers. And it was all about Buckminster Fuller's ideas of designs, transportation for the next 50 years. This was 1949. It was late in the fall, Christmas was coming up. The booklet had to be ready for the printer in a month's time. Sutnar and Buckminster Fuller collaborated on the what would be included, the overall design. Sutnar sketched all the pages out. And then I sat with Buckminster for 2 weeks, going over all his drawings for all his ideas for automobiles and boats, and automobiles that became boats, automobiles that became airplanes, all sorts of crazy ideas that were wonderful. I think this was the opening page, designed by Sutnar, but I did all the drafting and all the stylized drawing and organized the typefaces and pasted them in place when they came from the printer. Because of my performance, which they both appreciated, Sutnar one day told me I should consider going back to school. He was teaching at Pratt Institute, and he said, all American art students are badly educated. They just have very superficial knowledge of art history, if any. He said, go study art history. I had time left, 2 years left on the GI Bill. So I got into the NYU Institute of Fine Arts. And of course, that changed my whole life eventually. It took me 5 years to get the MA, but during that 5 years, I continued working with Mr. Sutnar. I was with him for a total of 7 years. This is a typical page we designed for the American Standard catalog. These were shower units for institutions. Of course, I saw them looking like skeletons with erections. And I actually did a painting of one of them that way, about to rape a young lady who starts off as a blotter on a blob of paint, rather, splatter on my drafting table. This was another typical page from the same catalog. Only I thought it was very funny, with the toilet lids flipping up and down, and it immediately made me think of Marcel Duchamp. Urinal, though it's not a urinal, it's a toilet seat flapping up and down. But that gave me my subject for my MA thesis, which had to be the first draft of what you were going to do for your doctorate thesis. Well, it took me 3 years to write. It was very influential on me, at any rate. And this was the last project I worked on with Sutnar, actually, which was for another publication entirely. He let me design the cover and do the interior illustrations. And I came up with this with his approval. I did the final drafting. But the next slide is a very recent painting that'll be in my next exhibition. And of course, that figure of the lantern, the old folded Japanese lantern, is a takeoff on that sun image, though I didn't realize it until much later, when I was putting these slides together, actually. At any rate, this is a recent painting, which is based on my premise of working directly from vision, directly from live models. The setup is there in my studio. I don't use photographs. Everything is done by visual measurement, side to side, color to color, shades of color, everything, the variations. Everything is kind of a visual measurement, which is a carryover from all those years doing drafting and layout. And I think the whole painting is a wonderful layout and clearly relates to my work with Sutnar. I'll go into a straight presentation of my painting career, which went on all through this period of being a designer, and then through the years which I got into education, teaching at Pratt Institute, Yale University for 1 year, and then just as visiting professor 1 day a week. But that all helped me get a job teaching at Brooklyn College, where I was for the next 25 years. And I was hired for my experience primarily with Ladislav Sutnar. Nobody ever hired me because of my painting. So again, this is the painting that was in Life magazine from my high school. And this is the other painting that won first prize in watercolor that year. And it took up 1/3 of a page in Life magazine. At that time, color reproductions were quite rare. So these paintings were quite startling in being shown in full color. Also, it led years later, when I came back after the war to Carnegie Tech to start my junior year, my second year, one of my fellow classmates was Andy Warhol, later Andy Warhol. But he came up to me the very first day of class, and he said, "How does it feel to be famous?" And I said, "Well, it only lasted," it only lasted 5 minutes. And that became kind of a running joke, and of course got expanded to a little more time. But as I said, after the following year, I was in the United States Army, and I did a series of watercolors of my everyday experiences in training, a lot of training exercises as rifleman. And this was evening when I was at a headquarters company working on those charts in Florida. Well, that nice job, as I said, only lasted a few months, and then I was put back into the infantry, took basic infantry training all over again, and shipped overseas. At this point, I began keeping a visual diary. I wasn't up to writing then. And this was on Army paper. Each drawing is about 4 by 5 inches, and they were in a little clipboard tablet. And I was drawing with an Army pen and ink. This was before the invention of ballpoint pens. So it was Army ink and an Army pen. We ended up in Naples, and to be replacements at the Battle of Monte Cassino. Fortunately, that ended. The actual fighting had ended a couple of weeks before we landed. And so we spent the next few months around the base of the Monte Cassino taking infantry training exercises, mostly in the form of having minor skirmishes and little battles, all done with live ammunition. There was no fooling around. And there were graves all over the place with Germans, Italians, and French, I think a few Algerian grave markers all over the place, dead soldiers in temporary graves. Well, the war ended. As I said, then I became part of an engineering unit rebuilding this highway between Rome and Florence, and we were with German prisoners of war. They were the ones who did all the work. We were the supervisors. I did some sign painting myself the first few months, but then the German prisoners took over. There were a few very highly skilled men skilled at sign painting. This was near Pisa. That's actually a park right outside the city of Pisa, which itself was leveled. All that was standing, it looked like a brickyard, and all that was standing was the cathedral and the Leaning Tower, the baptistry, and the sacred cemetery. But it was very close to where we were living, stationed. Well, this will be a flashback. This is, I mentioned before, doing a painting from that shower unit attacking a young girl. And this is that painting. It would have been done in 1949, the year Andy and I graduated from college and came up to New York City, where we roomed together for, well, as I say, most of a year. in a strange way, I got the idea of doing a series of hero paintings from this, largely of figures floating around in the sky. And before the next year had passed, I had started this painting, Superman. By this time, I was just beginning my studies in art history, but I had spent a lot of time at the Vatican during the time I was in Italy during the war. You could walk into the Sistine Chapel, which was empty, and I could lie down on my back and just look up at the ceiling for a long time, which I did. It was before the ceiling was clean, so it looked largely like a black and white Rembrandt painting. But this is the figure of Superman, which I picked up somewhere, an early comic book in New York. I picked up this, flipping through the comic book, I saw Superman keeping two missiles from colliding over New York City. And Superman is exactly in the same pose as Michelangelo's painting of God separating day from night. So, well, why not? Anyway, this is one of the paintings that followed that painting of the shower attacking the young girl. These are Dorothy's works, early work in her last year in Pittsburgh, after Andy and I were in New York. She developed very rapidly. These were done after we were married in 1950. And she did a series, she concentrated for the next couple years, next 5 years or 6 years, on paintings of subways and highways. The one on the left is someplace up along Roosevelt Drive. The one on the right is a subway. And she did these series of very finished drawings. This was a tunnel and the drawings that preceded them. She didn't work casually. This is one of the early paintings she did in New York, a view along the Riverside Drive, a series of studies she made from them that much more design-oriented on the left. The painting is on the left, the drawings are on the right. And there's one of her notebook pages, drawing of a subway above and drawings of Andy below. And on the other books, there are drawings of her subways. My work on the catalogs led me to the work of Marcel Duchamp and his good friend Francis Picabia. But I soon switched to Francis Picabia as the main subject of my thesis because he seemed to be the one who came up with the ideas first and did paintings of them first, and then Duchamp a few months later would do his own versions. This is one of, and they came to New York during World War I. As well, Duchamp was came as an escapee from the army, French army. Picabia was in the army, but he was a chauffeur for one of the generals. And he managed to get an assignment to bring some diplomatic letters to the United States. So he and his wife, Madame Duchamp, I forget her first name, but her second name was Buffet. The three of them came to New York and were responsible for the Dada movement. She's not given credit, but I eventually decided she really was the one who came up with the ideas. She was very smart, but I don't say that in my thesis. I leave it with Picabia as the idea man. And this is typical of the kind of painting he did during the years in America as a Dadaist. They became part of the big Dada movement that really started by a group of artists in Switzerland. They became the New York contingent. And this is Duchamp's big work at that time, during those years of World War I in New York. Huge painting. It's 8 feet high, and it's done on panes of plate glass in this aluminum or stainless steel frame, I guess it is. And it's photographed as it originally was installed in the home of the collector who bought it. Because it's on glass, you see through it into somebody else's backyard. But I'm the one who deciphered what all those machines meant, all those machines. So at least I'm the first one who translated all of his notes written in French. And I looked up the sources of his ideas and did the first published American translation, which has held up over the years. It's become the normal translation. The title of the painting is The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even. And I actually published an article when Picabia died on, I guess I have to call it, the symbolism of the paintings of Picabia and Duchamp, because my paper was done at the Institute of Fine Arts, and at that time, the Institute was all about the meaning of things, the symbolism, the iconography. So I had to give a real iconography to all their work, which was very significant for me because I decided for myself there would be no iconography. Whatever I did as a painter after that would have no ideas other than painting ideas. Most people don't want to believe me. At any rate, I began drawing rocks as a way of moving away from ideas. But this was the height of the abstract expressionist period in the early 1950s. And my wife, Dorothy, and I became part of the 10th Street scene. I became part of a gallery that was called the Tanager Gallery, but we were surrounded by all these famous artists. Willem de Kooning's studio was upstairs in this 4-story building. Franz Klein was next door. Other people lived around the corner on 4th Avenue in a studio building, Philip Guston and Jack Tworkov. And the gallery became a center where all these artists hung out. We put in a kerosene stove. Heat was very scarce then. It's hard to remember, the 1950s. Everybody was poor in that section of New York, the Lower East Side. There was no heat. Apartments were called cold water flats, but they had hot water, but you provided your own heat with kerosene or little coal stoves. So our gallery had a little kerosene stove. So people came in to get warm, and they drank coffee. But those people included people like Jackson Pollock occasionally, and de Kooning was there pretty often, and people like critics like Harold Rosenberg would drop in, and he lived down the block. Elaine de Kooning, of course, and other people. All of them at that time were the big names. And I loved their work. I was highly influenced by it and trying to find my own way. But I picked up a bushel basket of rocks out at Montauk Point, and I was making drawings from those, like this, wash drawings, using Japanese hairbrushes. And from those I developed paintings that masqueraded as abstract expressionist paintings. But some people recognized that the basis was landscape. Towards the end of that period, I spent a summer with my wife up in Maine, and we both spent the summer making works on paper, occasional oil painting. We rented a tiny shack without electricity, running water, anything, just a little kerosene lamp, a kerosene stove. And we lived on the edge of this inlet. And every day around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the water drained out. It was part of the Bay of Fundy, which has the highest or lowest drop, I guess it is, tidal drop in the world. And the water would just drain out and leave these crazy-looking rocks in the water, They looked like prehistoric monsters stuck in the mud. This is one of the more realistic ones I did. Straightforward representation. But most of my work that summer was, I began concentrating more on details, on sections of groups of rocks. That's more typical. And then I spent, say, part of that summer making paintings from these drawings, wash drawings, but also oil paintings on into the next year. At this point, I had stopped working for Mr. Sutnar and Sweets catalogs, but I had been doing layout at Life magazine, and I suddenly won a Fulbright fellowship to a year in Italy as an art student. And of course, I simply continued what I was doing. This is actually, we were sent to Perugia first. This is a watercolor I did. It's a view of Assisi from Perugia, looking very much like an abstract expressionist painting. It's in transparent watercolor. But pretty soon, I graduated to concentrating on the Roman ruins. We spent the rest of the year in Rome in residence, and I spent my winter there in the Roman Forum, drawing as detailed as I could, bringing all my skills as a draftsman at this point to these drawings. This is the back of the Palatine Hill, there was a gigantic racing stadium built there, and this is part of where the grandstands were. This is inside the Palatine itself, part of the palace, Imperial Palace. And from these drawings, I began doing paintings. Again, using abstract expressionist brushwork, but more or less as my own form of impressionism and symbolism. The paintings were large even then. This, I believe, was about 4 feet high. And that following summer, we spent down in Positano, and these were the cliffs above the ocean, which is right at the bottom. I spent a week on each of these drawings, making them as detailed as I could. And I did a series of paintings from them. This is from a different one of that series of drawings. But during that winter, Fellini had been shooting the movie La Dolce Vita, and my wife and I had spent one night on the set, which was in the Baths of Caracalla, which was set up as a nightclub scene. And every time the actual filming started, these flares would come on, and the cliffs were lit up. The ruins were lit up with these flame-like colors from the torches. The film itself is in black and white, so you don't see the color, but you see them in my paintings. I did a series of them in this flaming light. Well, that nice year ended, and we came back, and I immediately got a teaching job at Pratt Institute. As I say, largely because of my background in graphic design, and also because I had a background in art history. And so I taught design and art history courses, art history survey courses. And to fill in my time, my schedule, they gave me figure drawing. But I took the figure as a rock. I saw them as a continuation of those drawings of rocks in Maine and the Roman ruins. And then one of the fellow teachers at Pratt, Mercedes Matter, invited all of us, all the faculty, to come to her place Sunday evenings to draw from models. About 8 of us did. We met every Sunday night at 6 o'clock in the evening and drew until midnight, nonstop. Every 20, 25 minutes, we took a few minutes break. Nobody talked. The group included Philip Guston and Jack Tworkoff, that kind of group. I can't remember the other names. But among the younger artists, there were Mary Frank and Paul Georges, occasionally Alex Katz, Lois Dodd, Charles Cajori, and myself, Gabriel Latterman. And everybody drew very intensely, in their own way, and nobody looked at anybody else's drawings. And except one night I became conscious of the fact that everybody was looking at my drawing. I was the only one drawing, making continuous outlines, which made me very self-conscious. You weren't supposed to do that at the time because it was a throwback to some sort of academic procedure. But I wasn't using academic procedure. I was strictly drawing by vision and measuring side to side, contour by contour, tone by tone, and looking for my own kind of expressionist, abstract expressionist-oriented composition. But I would start in the middle of the page and just let the drawing go out to the edges, and where it ended was purely arbitrary. This is the later drawing. I calmed down, got more accurate, but still working in my own non-traditional way. And Mercedes very often had two models posing together. I'm not sure where the models came from. Occasionally I would recognize one of them as a student at Pratt, but most of them weren't. I liked this drawing, which is very close to the rock drawings in Maine, and I decided to make a painting of it. And this is actually one of the first paintings I tried to do. Again, it's about 4 feet wide. But I really didn't know what to do. I didn't want it to become an illustration of some sort, nothing telling a story, no relationship between the two figures. And I wasn't sure how to develop the figure in terms of paint. So I more or less copied my drawing. At that point, I wrote an article called Figure Paintings Are Not Made in Heaven, referring to the Buddhist practice of the artist going into a trance somehow and transporting his mind to heaven, where he observed a goddess that he had to make a representation of and kept that vision in his mind as his model when he comes back to earth. And I said, today figure painting comes out of the history of art, something like that. Anyway, at that time I got more ambitious. I recognized that I could only go forward at this point by working directly from the models rather than from the drawing. The drawing being done from visual experience, the surfaces had to be painted from visual experience as well. This was the first one I picked, and it's 6 feet high, which means the figure in the foreground is somewhat over life size, and the fact that both figures are black people was startling. By that time I had a gallery dealer, Alan Frumkin, who had taken me on for those Roman landscape paintings. When he came to see this, he sort of said, oi, they. He said, we're never going to be able to exhibit that, we'll get arrested. However, I went on, I kept doing them, a couple more, I began hiring the models from Mercedes Matters drawing group to come to my studio, and I worked directly from life. And Alan Frumkin agreed to give me a monthly allowance towards paying the model fees. And I continued to work like that for years later, till now. This is a much more developed painting, of course, many years later, much more elaborate. The painting is 6 feet wide. And the model in the foreground, one day happened to pass that little painting of the carousel that I had done in high school, which I had hanging on the studio wall. And she looked at that and looked at this composition with the animals running around in a circle. And she said, boy, you really haven't come very far, have you? She went on to become a medical student. This was an even later painting, and it was the writer of the New York Times, Michael Kimmelman at the time, invited himself, he heard me speak somewhere, invited himself to come watch a painting develop in my studio. And he came every day that I worked on the painting, which was, I think 2 sessions a week over a 3-month period. And he wrote about each of those sessions in an article at the end of when the painting was completed. This was probably at the end of the second or third session. This is the final painting. The model in the foreground, the man sitting there, suddenly one day said, I have an interpretation for this setup. The airplane represents 9/11. Mickey Mouse represents the American people, and we're under attack. And I said, well, I don't want to go into that, but what amuses me and what I've been working on here is the fact that your hairline is a repetition of Mickey Mouse's. And the next day he came in with his head shaven. These are the 3 most recent paintings of mine. Then, last summer. I bought the masks online. They were 1930s paper mache. I just liked them. And one of the models was here when I was unpacking them after they arrived. And she put one on and began dancing around. I had no idea, no intention of using them as part of a setup, but I said, okay, you're stuck with it. So I did these 3 paintings, and that concluded the show.